Hello everyone, in today's video we are going to discuss the second part of how to play the French defense, especially in particular the Tarrasch variation with the black pieces. It's the opening that is played highly in the highest level or in the lower level or even in the intermediate level. If you are playing the French defense, you must know this particular variation. So I don't want to waste any further time, so let's quickly jump into the video. So white starts with 1 e4 and we play the move e6, also known as the French defense, d4, d5, and here already there are many variations for white to continue the game. We have the advanced, we have the exchange, we have the Unravel or classical, we have the Tarrasch. Generally, many players who want to trick their opponent starts with the move knight to d2 because it is a particular variation that for a French beginner they will definitely get confused and white will have a healthy position. So after knight to d2, in my previous video I have already discussed to play the move c5. White plays the move knight to f3, and here we capture the pawn on c into d4. And here after c into d4, white can play the move e into d5, followed by queen into d5, where after bishop c4 we have a transposition after queen d6. Short castle, knight f6, and the game continues. This particular variation I have already covered in the previous video. You can go and check it out. So today, at the place of e into d5, we are going to discuss what happens if white goes for capturing the pawn knight into d4, which makes a total sense. After knight into d4, we are going to continue with knight to c6. What's our idea? We are capturing knight on d4. So after knight to c6, white is having two ways to continue the position, whether to capture the knight or to play the move bishop to b5. So first, let's try to discuss what happens if white plays the move knight into c6. After knight into c6, we can happily capture the knight back. White plays bishop to d3, trying to develop the bishop, and also the idea is to simply short castle, which makes a total sense. And after bishop d3, we play the move knight to f6. First, developing our knight, because keeping our bishop flexible, whether it goes to d6 or to c5, though generally it goes to d6. After knight to f6, if in case white tries to play the move e5, it is already a bad move after knight d7, because we can happily put pressure on the e5 pawn followed by queen c7, and white can't really protect it via f4, because after queen d6, we are taking all the chances white is having to do a short castle, and black is already very comfortable in this position because we are having a total control on the dark square. So going back, e5 is already a bad move. The main move is to do a short castle, and after short castle, we play the move bishop d6, developing our bishop. White plays queen e2. The idea is to play the move e5, attacking both the pieces. So we play the move queen to c7, stopping e5 and also preparing to capture the h2 pawn. So here white plays h3, which makes sense, and here we do a short castle. Castle as soon as possible. So after short castle, white plays the move c4, trying to put pressure on the center. And guys, you must remember, do not ever take either of the pawn, because if you take either of the pawn, you would only be having a bad pawn structure. So it is always advisable after c4, just focus on developing your pieces, like bishop to b7 in this position. And after bishop b7, black has completed all its development. There are no issues for black in this particular position. For example, after rook e1, the idea is to play the move e5. We can happily play the move e5, and here black is already very comfortable. We can play the move d4 if we get the chance, followed by c5, putting pressure on the pawn on e4, and we are having the open b file followed by a5, a4. Black is very comfortable in this position. So going back, what happens if after knight to c6, at the place of capturing the knight, white goes for playing the move bishop to b5, which is generally the main move. After bishop to b5, we play the move bishop d7, protecting the knight. And here, again, our idea is to simply capture the knight. So generally, after knight bishop to d7, white plays the move knight into c6, which is the only move. B into c6, attacking the bishop goes back, and here we play the move bishop to d6, developing our bishop, and also not allowing white to push the pawn to e5. So after bishop d6, here white is having two ways to continue the position. One is short castle, or the other is to play the move queen e2. First, let's try to discuss what happens if white plays the move queen to e2. After queen e2, white's idea is to push the pawn to e5. So we play the move e5 because not allowing white to play the move e5. Because once white gets the move e5, white would be having more space in the center that could lead to many problems that black could face in the future. So after queen e2, we play the move e5 instead. And here white is having 4 moves to continue the position practically, which is c4, ed5, f4, and doing a short castle. So we are going to look at it one by one. First, let's start what happens after e into d5. After e into d5, we capture the pawn back, and white plays the move c4, which makes pretty much sense. White is trying to put pressure on the center pawns. After c4, we play the move knight to e7, not developing the knight to f6, because after knight e7, we are having the extra option of pushing the pawn to e4, attacking the bishop, because the pawn would no longer be pinned by the pawn, because the knight is already on e7. So after knight to e7, white captures the pawn, and here we captures the pawn back. And here again, white is having 2 options to continue the position, which is knight to c4 or bishop to e4. If white plays knight to c4 in this position, after knight c4, attacking the pawn and the bishop, we simply play the move bishop to b4 check, which comes with a tempo, bishop to d2, and here simply short castle. Just not capturing the bishop. You can capture the bishop if you want, but just play it safe. Do simply a short castle and be happy. After short castle, bishop into h7 check, king h7, queen to e4 check, and at the same time capturing the knight, takes, and here we can play the move rook to b8. Not capturing the bishop. Do not get invited to capture the bishop. Just keep on developing your pieces. Rook b8, and after bishop b4, rook b4, short castle, bishop e6, double attack. So here we have a forced queen trade, knight takes pawn, rook takes pawn. White is a pawner, but it's just a half pawn because of the corner pawn, and eventually it's a draw. Black is having counterplay by just putting the rook to second rank, and it's a completely drawish position. So this is what happens if white plays the move knight to c4. Now going back, what happens if white plays the main move, which is bishop to e4, attacking the knight and the rook. After bishop e4, we play the move knight f4, jumping in with the knight, attacking the queen. The queen goes to a6, which looks pretty sensible, because now white is hitting the bishop and attacking the rook as well. So we can't protect everything at the same time. So after queen a6, we are going to play the move bishop to c5, inviting our opponent to capture the rook. Because once our opponent captures the rook, after queen into a8, black is already completely winning in this position, because g2 is completely collapsing and there is no way white can defend this position. For example, if f3 in case, still knight into g2, and black is completely winning in this position. So it makes no sense for white to capture the rook, because it's a complete blunder. So the best move is to simply do a short castle, where now we can play the move rook b8, simply moving the rook, knight b3, attacking the bishop. So we simply come back with the bishop, bishop into knight, pawn takes, rook to d1, putting pressure on the bishop, but simply short castle. And again, white can simply sacrifice the bishop, king takes, queen to d3 check, king g8 takes, and now simply queen f6. Not trading off the queen, but playing the move queen f6 at a very nice square. Material wise, we are a pawn down, but b2 is hanging. We have a strong pawn on f4, which at any time we can push to f3. We can play the move rook d8, and eventually it's a complete drawish position with black having more counterplay in this position. It's an equal position. So this is what happens if white plays the move bishop to e4 in this position. So going back, so we have discussed what happens if white plays the move e into d5. So now let's try to discuss what happens if white plays the move f4, which is a bad move. After f4, it makes sense because we cannot capture the pawn, because after e into d5, it comes with a check, which makes sense for white to play the move f4. But after f4, we just need to keep focusing on our development. So after f4, we are going to play the move knight to f6, f into e5, bishop into e5. And here, if white tries to capture the pawn, we can happily short castle. because white cannot capture the bishop because of rook e8. So it's not really working. So going back, knight to f3, which is the main move, and now simply bishop g4, pinning up the knight. And after e d5, still short castle and nothing is happening. The bishop cannot be captured because of rook e8, and black is having more than enough counterplay to have a good position. So for example, if white do a short castle, for just God's sake, we can play bishop to d4 check, king to h1, and now simply rook e8. You can already sense how black is having such a pleasant position. All his pieces are developed. So this is what happens if white plays the move f4 in this position. So going back, what happens if white plays the move c4? After c4, we are going to push the pawn to d4. White plays the move c5. We capture the pawn, and here again white is having two options, which is knight c4 and short castle. If white plays the move short castle, we play the move knight f6, knight to c4, putting pressure on the pawn on e5. We can simply develop our queen by protecting the pawn on e5. And here, just like white is again having three moves, which is a3, h3, and f4, which all the moves make complete sense. So we are going to discuss one by one. If f4 directly, we can play the move simply pawn takes, bishop takes, and now knight to g4. What's the idea? Here, after bishop into f4, white's idea could be to push the pawn or even to play the move bishop g5, pinning up the knight. So it's very important to move the knight first. After knight to g4, h3, we are playing the move knight to e3, sacrificing a pawn, and after rook c1, short castle, takes, takes, takes. The position is roundabout equal after a5 because white is having a weakness, we are having a weakness, and eventually it's a drawish position. So this is what happens if white plays the move f4. So going back, what happens if white plays the move h3? Because the idea here is, now white wants to play the move f4, stopping knight to g4. So here after h3, we are going to short castle, f4, and here we are simply going to capture the pawn. Bishop into pawn, and here we are having a very interesting move, which is knight to d5. After knight d5, we are sacrificing the knight, and eventually after queen takes, we are having the move d3, check, eventually capturing the bishop. And the king move, we capture the bishop, and black is the one having a better position. So this is what happens if white plays the move h3. So coming to the main move, what happens if white plays the move a3? Now what's the idea of a3? It looks pretty artificial, and it's definitely not practically possible for your opponent to find this particular move on the board. After a3, white's idea is to play the move b4, which is very deep. After a3, short castle, f4, the same thing, pawn checks, and here white plays the move b4. The idea here is, after b4, white kicks the bishop so that black is having no longer control of the d6 square. So that after bishop b6, bishop into f4, now white's idea is to play the move bishop g5, which could be very deadly for black to open up black's king. So we must move our knight to g4, but it simply invites white to play the move bishop to d6, attacking the queen and the rook at the same time. But here we can happily play the move queen g5, because after queen g5, if white tries to capture the rook, rook takes, and here black is very comfortable despite being an exchange round because of our strong pawn on d4. Here black can simply continue the game via bishop e6, bishop c7, putting pressure on the king, and black is actually having many great practical chances, and black is even better according to the engine. So this is how you can say that this position is already better for black. But a3 is extremely hard to find for white. Now going back, this is what happens if your opponent plays the move short castle. So now let's try to discuss what happens if your opponent plays the move knight to c4 directly, trying to attack the pawn on e5, which is the main move. After knight c4, we play the move bishop to b4 check first, bishop to d2, and now playing the move queen e7, developing the queen. The idea here is, if white captures the bishop, we capture the bishop with a check, and after a move like maybe queen d2, we can happily trade off the queen in a better position and play the move f6, and we are simply a pawn up. So going back, it's not a good move. White must castle in the position, and here we can simply capture the bishop, queen takes, and play the move knight to h6, which is very interesting. You cannot play the move knight f6 because of queen to g5, and it attacks both the pawn. That's the reason we are playing the move knight to h6 to cover the g5 square. And after knight h6, f4, we play the move knight to g4. It's the same idea with a knight g4, knight to e3. This same idea is repeating again and again. After knight g4, h3, attacking the knight, knight to e3. If white captures the pawn, we can happily capture the pawn back, and it's black is still better. h3, knight to e3, giving up the pawn back, capturing the f4 pawn, rook takes, short castle. And we have an even position, because white is having 5 pawn, we are having 5 pawn. White is having a weakness, we are having a weakness, and it's an even position. So this is what happens if your opponent plays the move c4. So now let's come into the main move, which is what happens if your opponent plays the move short castle. Which makes sense. After short castle, we are going to play the move queen to e7. Basically, not allowing white to keep this pin any longer. And after queen e7, white is having 3 options to continue the position, which is c4, rook e1, or to capture the pawn on d5. Let's discuss it one by one. What happens if e into d5? After e into d5, we capture the pawn back with c into d5. And after c into d5, white plays the move c4, pushing the pawn and putting pressure on the center pawns. After c4, we play the move simply e4, kicking the bishop. That's the idea of putting the queen to e7. Bishop to b1, and now simply f5, pushing the pawn on the king side. Pawn takes, knight f6, knight c4, simply short castle. And black is after a4, f4, knight takes, queen takes, bishop takes pawn, simply rook e8. Black is very comfortable in this position, attacking the bishop 2 times, f3, bishop f5. Now triple attack, queen f2, simply capture the bishop, takes, queen takes, and we have an even position. White is a pawn up, but it's a complete dead draw position because of this strong pin on g2. And black's all pieces are developed. It's an opposite color bishop, so it's a complete drawish position. So this is what happens if your opponent plays the move e into d5. So what happens if your opponent plays the move rook e1, focusing on developing the pieces. After rook e1, we play the move f5. That's the idea of not yet committing the knight. We can play the move f5, ef5, and now playing the move knight to f6. With a very strong center, the turbo center, we can play simply short castle, e4 now, capture the pawn, having a strong center, having a good position, and white is already having many problems on developing his pieces, the rest of his pieces. So this is exactly what happens if your opponent plays the move rook e1. So now coming to the main move, what happens if your opponent plays the move c4? So after c4, we play the move d4, pushing the pawn, f4, trying to put pressure on the pawn on e5, and here we simply develop r9. Because after pawn takes, bishop takes, white plays the move h3. Why? Because if white doesn't play h3, we are having some ideas with a knight g4 or bishop g4. For example, if knight f3, we can already play our bishop to g4, having a good position. That's the reason white must play the move h3 first in order to cover the g4 square, and now simply bishop e6. Now you all must be wondering, what's the idea of playing the move bishop to e6? The main idea of e6 here is to play the move knight d7 and cover the e5 square. Because after knight to f3, we play the move knight g7, takes, and after bishop f4, we play the move bishop to d7 back. Again, protecting the e5 square and covering the e5 square, not allowing white to push any kind of e5. And black is already very comfortable. We have established a full center control and with a clear outpost on e5, and black is very comfortable in the position. We can play c5, short castle, and black is very comfortable. So yeah, this is what happens after short castle. Your opponent can play the move c4. So yeah, this was the variation, exactly what happens after short castle. So now let's try to discuss what happens if at the place of queen e2, your opponent goes for the move short castle. After short castle, we are going to play the move queen to c7, simply attacking the pawn on h2. And here, white is having 2 ways to continue the position, which is knight f3 and h3. If white plays the move h3, we are going to develop our knight, c4, and simply short castle. Just focus on developing your pieces first. It doesn't matter what your opponent does. If something is happening, then only you must reply to that particular reaction, like in this particular scenario. But if nothing is happening, just keep on developing your pieces, like this, castle as soon as possible. And this position is extremely equal after a short castle, because black can play the move a5, a4, maybe can trade everything on e4, like pawn takes, knight takes, and play the move e5, f5, and black is already very comfortable in this position. So this is exactly what happens if your opponent plays the move h3. Now going back, what happens if your opponent plays knight f3? Which makes sense, he's developing the piece and also protecting the pawn. We push the pawn to e5, rook to e1, knight to e7. The same idea. We can have f5 in the future. That's the reason we are putting our knight to e7. And after knight e7, black is very comfortable already, followed by short castle f5, as I said, and black is very comfortable in this position, already better in this position because of the strong center black is having. So yeah guys, that's it for today. We have covered everything in the Tarrasch 3 knight d2 variation. Now you are fully prepared to face the Tarrasch, and you are never going to ever lose in the Tarrasch variation. We have covered each and every variation in every particular detail. So if you learned anything new in this particular video, then make sure to like this video and share this video with everyone, with your friends who plays the French defense and who wants to improve their French defense opening. So if you want any particular video on any particular opening, you can just tell me in the comment box below, and I'm going to come with that particular video. So if you are not yet a subscriber, then make sure to subscribe to our video. It's free for you, but it helps us to motivate to make videos like this. So I'm going to see you soon. So till then, stay tuned and keep watching OneShot Chess.